Hello everybody and welcome to Unicorn Horns, a discussion series about Chinese science fiction. Today we'll be discussing The Reincarnated Giant by Wang Jinkang and translated by Carlos Rojas. It's a cautionary tale about wealth and power, about a businessman who turns himself into a giant baby. Today's story comes from this collection called The Reincarnated Giant, an anthology of 21st century Chinese science fiction. This is edited by Mingwei Song and Theodore Hooters. So Wang Jinkang is another big name in the world of Chinese science fiction. He is considered to be one of the three generals of contemporary Chinese science fiction. We've spoken a little bit about the other two generals, Liu Cixin and Han Song. Of course, Liu Cixin, the author of The Three-Body Problem, has had much of his work translated into English, thankfully, over the past few years. But Wang Jinkang has not had as much work translated. There is an Amazon Crossing book that you can find, Pathological, translated by Jeremy Tiang. And there is also a story printed in a new collection called Synopticon that came out just a few months ago, I believe. So what does it mean to be one of the three generals of Chinese science fiction? Well, the name refers to how influential these three authors were to the modern wave of Chinese science fiction. Many people have pinpointed three waves in the history of Chinese science fiction. There was a wave in the turn of the century in the late Qing. Then the second wave came much later in the mid-1980s. And then the final wave is where we are right now, which started in the late 90s and early 2000s. These three authors, Liu Cixin, Han Song, and Wang Jinkang, all started writing around the late 90s and early 2000s, and they are considered to be the ones who built this wave that we are currently in now. So Wang Jinkang was born in 1948. He graduated from high school in 1966, and he got a job as an engineer for Nanyang oil fields in 1978. He is a prolific author, and despite the fact that not many of his works have been translated in English so far, he has written many novels and over 40 short stories. The editor of this collection, Mingwei Song, writes that Wang Jinkang is a humanist who has worked to keep alive the utopian impulse for a hopeful future, with the exception of the story we're reading today. So the story that we're reading today follows the life of a billionaire from J Nation named Imagai Nashihiko. He is the CEO of Western Steel Group. Imagai has figured out a way to transfer his brain into a new body, unlocking the key to eternal life. The idea is that he would transfer his brain into the body of a baby, and then he would maintain that body until he can't anymore, and then find a new body to transfer his brain into. Of course, he has enough power and wealth that he is able to find someone who would be willing to donate a baby for him to transfer his brain into. However, the scientist who narrates this story soon discovers that there is a problem in this process. The baby body is not able to withstand the excessive adult greed of the brain that has been placed into it. So the baby is excessively hungry, and they start having to hire over 1,000 wet nurses to feed Mr. Imagai every day. Soon the baby's body starts to grow much larger due to this excess food. The scientist begins to worry that the baby's body is so large that it might crush and kill himself under his weight. Eventually they decide to move this new large baby, Mr. Imagai, into an ocean so that he can be buoyed a little bit by water, and that would keep him from crushing himself. As the story goes on, it becomes more and more difficult to keep Mr. Imagai fed, and eventually Mr. Imagai dies of starvation. So the story is fairly silly, and you could just read it as a comedic critique of greed. But given that the story focuses on J Nation and on this Japanese billionaire, and the fact that Wang Jinkang wrote this story anonymously, all points to the idea that there is also a critique going on here of China as a nation. The Reincarnated Giant was written in 2006, 2 years before the Beijing Olympics. And Mingwei Song writes that this story foregrounds an unsatisfied desire for zengjiang, growth, a ubiquitous keyword in current news coverage of China's economic leap, marked by a continuous escalating GDP. So this image of a giant billionaire baby could be a critique on this focus on economic development. Mingwei Song also writes, "Science fiction today both strengthens and complicates the utopian vision of a new and powerful China. It mingles nationalism with utopianism and dystopianism, mixes sharp social criticism with an acute awareness of China's potential for further reform, and wraps political consciousness in scientific discourses about the powers of technology and the technologies of power." I think there's a lot you could say about what Wang Jinkang is critiquing in this story, but I think for the purposes of this video, it's interesting to look at this in the backdrop of Wang Jinkang as one of the three generals of Chinese science fiction. Wang Jinkang is the oldest of the three generals. He was born in 1948. He lived through the Great Leap Forward, and he graduated from high school just at the start of the Communist Revolution. His experience growing up leads to that acute awareness that Mingwei Song mentions. It's an awareness that really only comes from experiencing firsthand these extreme changes in Chinese modern history. So Wang Jinkang's story could be read as a cautionary tale, but I think it's useful to read his stories with this backdrop of what he experienced growing up in Chinese modern history. So I'll leave it there for today, but I recommend this story to anyone who is interested. And if you have any comments or thoughts about the story, please feel free to leave a comment, and I will post the link for this book down below. So thank you everybody for watching, and if you would like to subscribe, please do. Thank you. Bye-bye.